friends, and welcome back to 155 Books. My name is Shannon, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my 5 favourite spring reads. So in an attempt to make it feel a bit more spring-like, I thought I would talk about my 5 favourite spring reads or books that kind of remind me of spring, just to maybe make the weather a little bit better, because it is currently the bank holiday, the first May bank holiday, and it is miserable outside in a classic May bank holiday style. So I'm hoping I can manifest some good weather by talking about these 5 books. But without further ado, let's get straight into it. So the first book that immediately sprang to mind when I thought about making this video was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. There's, I think, many reasons why this is probably one of my favourite spring reads. Firstly, I did read it in spring, when the first and only time I have read it. I think Shakespeare just in general reminds me of spring, because obviously Shakespeare's birthday is spring. He's a Taurus like myself, which makes me very, very happy. And also the first time, and again only time so far, that I have visited Stratford-upon-Avon, it was during the Easter weekend, and it was so spring-like when we went. There was blossom on the trees, it was a beautiful spring weekend, we had really great weather, and I also went to see the performance of Hamnet whilst in Stratford-upon-Avon, which again I think makes me obviously think of this book as a spring type book. But I think the setting and the story and just the atmosphere of this book again is also very spring-like. So if you aren't aware, this one won the Women's Prize for Fiction back in either 2020 or 2021, I can't remember the exact year, but for me it was beautifully written and deserved as a deserved winner of the Women's Prize for Fiction. So this one is a historical fiction novel following Shakespeare's wife, but also their sort of love story, but more specifically the death of their son Hamnet. That's all I'm going to say about the synopsis, because going into this kind of blind is the best thing to do, because then it just hits you with whimsy, and it's magical, and it's sad, and there's love, and there's grief, and there's death, and there's just everything in this book, and it's so beautifully written, woven together. The performance of it was spectacular. I also kind of feel like this book has a theme of rejuvenation, I guess, in a sense of not moving on, but sort of moving forward, and that kind of reminds me of spring quite a lot. So after sort of dealing with the heavy winter, spring is a reminder that you are still able to move forward, and I think this book resonates that very well. The next book on my list is a contemporary fiction novel that I read again, I think around in the same year I read Hamnet. It was a very good reading year for me. But that is Expectation by Anna Hope. I've talked about this one a few times on my channel, and it was quite hyped when it first came out, and that's how it made it onto my radar. And obviously, as you can tell, I bought the hardback of it, and that's how you know I was really interested in reading it when it first came out. It took me a while to get round to reading it, but when I did, I loved it, and I gave it 5 stars. So this one is a sort of in-depth look at female friendships over the years. So it follows 3 women called Hannah, Kate and Lisa, and so it kind of shows, it flashes backwards and forwards a little bit. It shows them as they are now sort of in their 30s approaching 40s, and then kind of flashes back to how they met, what they were like when they were younger, and how obviously their lives have maybe changed quite drastically, and how that's affected their friendship. I would check the content warnings for this, because there is discussion on fertility issues, cheating, which I know is a big trigger for some people, is kind of woven into this. I would say another big theme throughout this isn't just the female friendship, it's also sort of a lot about motherhood, I guess, and what it means to be either a mother, choose not to be a mother, have fertility issues, be a mother, and have a daughter whose relationship the relationship you have with her is fractured, but not past repair. So there's so many different kind of sides of motherhood that is sort of seen in this, which I wasn't expecting going into it. And because of that, it made me kind of reflect on myself and my own thoughts on motherhood. And I think for the first time ever, this made me unafraid of that, which was actually really freeing, and an unexpected 5-star read. Really loved it. I think I would return to this, read it again, and still get quite a lot out of it. The writing is very sort of a simple style. I think it is kind of compared to Normal People, but I wouldn't, or Sally Rooney's books in general, but I wouldn't really compare the two. This is its own thing. And again, it just reminds me of spring, because again, it's got this like massive theme of hope, and again, moving forward, which are themes that spring reminds me of anyway. The next book on this list is a non-fiction book, and that is Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. I'm going to have a completely separate, very long, in-depth video about this book coming at the end of the month. However, I read this at the end of March and devoured it really quickly. I listened to it on audiobook, and it was the first Cal Newport book that I had read. Deep Work was the one I was most interested to begin with, and then at the beginning of March this one kind of came onto my radar. I don't know how I didn't know about this one, and I knew immediately that I wanted to pick it up and read it, and I got so much out of this book. Without going into too much depth about this, obviously it does what it says on the tin. It's about choosing a focused life in a noisy world. So Cal Newport divides his book into two parts. The first, he sort of discusses the topic in general, gives some sort of like research-based examples of why being a digital minimalist is important, and then the second part is the practices in order to be a digital minimalist. One of the biggest parts of this is doing at least a 30-day digital detox, which I did in April, but like I said, I'm doing a completely separate video on that. But again, spring reminds me of spring cleaning and tidying and decluttering your life, and I really like the idea of minimalism and decluttering, but doing that digitally is a very interesting concept, and I think I'm very glad I read this book, because it kind of goes into how you should do that. Yes, and it massively changed my life. So a very, very important spring read for me on this list. Favourite book, favourite spring read, definitely. But like I say, more coming on this in a separate video at the end of the month. So a favourite seasonal reads video would be incomplete without a Jane Austen novel, but for my favourite spring read, I have picked Emma. So I've actually only read Emma and Pride and Prejudice, which is very bad. As someone who adores Pride and Prejudice and really enjoyed Emma, I really need to read the rest of the Jane Austen works, and then maybe another one would feature on this video. However, I think Emma, again, it's just got spring vibes for me. A lot of this one takes place, there's a lot of picnics, if I remember. I've completely forgotten, because it's been a long time since I've read this, which means it's definitely time for a reread for me. But Emma in general just screams spring to me, because of, again, her character, in that she likes to matchmake, and spring of course is the time for things blooming, and obviously there's lots of blooming relationships in this, even if a lot of them are not the correct ones. I think that kind of adds to the fun of it, in that like it's spring, again the whole rejuvenation thing, but sort of maybe sometimes doing it incorrectly. Yes, and obviously the cover of this as well is very spring-like and colourful, which I love very much. And the last book on this list is actually one that I don't own, and it's the first book in a series, and I don't own any of the books in the series. I did at one point have the first book, but I think I unhauled it, and I read the rest of them from the library. It's the only time I've ever read books from the library, which is, I know that sounds ridiculous, but it feels so wrong to me that I don't have a set of these books. But I think it's because I'm waiting for some special editions to be done. But the book and series I'm talking about, because for spring I'm not just talking about the first book, I'm talking about the whole series, because you could just devour it in one season, in a week, in a month, because they read really quickly. But that is The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. So I love this series so much, and again it's weird because I feel like I never talk about it on this channel, and I think it's because I don't have the books, so it feels really weird. But I first read this book while I was on my year abroad in Malta. It was one of the many books I read that year that I read on a plane, either coming home or going or visiting, or I spent a lot of that year obviously travelling by plane. And I just remember, I think I finished it. I started and finished it. I started it at the airport and I finished it on the plane before we landed. And yes, it was when I was coming home for summer, and then I read the rest of the books over the summer holiday. Everything about this series is amazing. And everything about it, for me personally, screams spring. So this series follows a main character. I think her name is called Blue. It's been so long since I've read them, I don't remember. And either at her school, is it at her school? I think it's at her school. There is these 4 boys that are called the Raven Boys, or they go to a school and that's why they're called the Raven Boys. Anyway, and Blue's mother and family, or the women in her family, are sort of like psychic, and they've got sort of like psychic kind of powers. And I think it's on Blue's birthday, she goes to the graveyard and she sees a vision, or is told the first boy she loves will die or something like that, and it turns out to be one of the Raven Boys. But it's way more complex and interesting than that. So much stuff happens. There's ley lines involved, and archaeology, and Welsh kings, and all of this stuff is kind of like interwoven into the story, and it's just so well written, well done, beautiful. There are like plot twists left, right and centre. Everyone has a favourite Raven Boy, and you just finish this series and you just want more, because the 4 books is not enough. And it's, again, making me really, really want to reread this series. So those are my 5 favourite spring reads. Please let me know in the comments down below what your favourite spring read is, or a book that reminds you of spring. I love compiling these lists because it also, like I say, reminds me of some books I've really loved, the time in which I read them, and obviously the fact that I want to reread them, or the fact that I don't own them. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you soon in my next video. Bye!